China's importance to the Australian economy has exploded over the past decade, fueled by an apparently insatiable need for iron ore and helped along by increasing demand for luxury goods as the country became richer, analysis of UN trade data reveals. It's almost as if China has a voracious appetite for the resources and consumer goods that Australia has in abundance. Who would have thought? But you know what's funny? Australia is not nearly so important to China. The United States, Japan, and Korea all import multiples of what Australia takes from China. Even relatively distant countries like the United Kingdom and Germany are far bigger markets for China's goods. Australia is clinging to the attention of the popular kid at school, China, like a needy ex-girlfriend. Accounting for almost 30% of all trade, China is currently Australia's greatest trading partner, putting Australia dangerously dependent on its economic relations. In this video, we'll talk about how China made Australia her slave. Before we get started with the chapters of this video, what are your thoughts on the relationship between China and Australia? Let us know with some facts. When a historic free trade agreement was completed in late 2014, Australia's relations with China reached a new height. China was more than willing to provide Australia with more access to its rapidly expanding market at the time, and it did so with gusto. What's a little reciprocation amongst friends, after all? With the extra benefit of possibly weakening Australia's security relationship with the United States, China was keen to forge relations with this important supplier of agricultural products and raw materials. Bilateral trade grew rapidly in the years that followed, and Chinese investment into Australia soared along with it. China was downright giddy, cozying up to its new best friend and showering it with economic affection. Australia, on the other hand, was gleefully happy to have the popular kid in school pay them attention. Australia saw its thriving trade relationship with its biggest economic partner as a geopolitical gamble that will allow it to branch out from its long-standing alliance with the United States. A look at trade data reveals just how reliant Australia has become on China. Of the $88 billion in total exports to China in 2018, $43 billion was in the form of iron ore, slag, and ash. Another $13 billion was in unspecified commodities, $11 billion in mineral fuels, and $4.3 billion in pearls and precious stones. In other words, China's seemingly insatiable demand for the raw materials and resources that power its economy has made it by far the predominant destination for Australian exports. This makes Australia the most China-dependent major economy in the world. While other resource-rich nations like Brazil and Indonesia also send a significant share of their exports to China, 27% and 15% respectively, no other developed country comes close to Australia's 37% figure. The Australia-China trade relationship becomes worse when looking at imports. Australia imported $58 billion worth of commodities from China in 2018, including $10.6 billion in machinery, $3.5 billion in furniture, and $13 billion in electrical equipment. And Australia's dependence on China extends beyond commerce in goods. The Aussies have gone all in on the China tourism and international student gravy train as well. China was Australia's leading source of short-term tourists before its travel restrictions caused it to lose its position to New Zealand. In 2019, China sent 1.44 million visitors to Australia, making up a cool 15% of the total. China's students' share of Australia's lucrative international higher education industry dropped from 40% in 2019 to about 23% in 2023. But it still remains the highest majority in overseas students. For an extended period, the business community and government have been embracing their close economic ties with China, giving each other high fives and raising glasses to their shared prosperity. But thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic and China's subsequent trade actions against Australia, Those cozy economic ties are looking more like an unhealthy dependency, exposing the significant vulnerabilities that come with being in bed with a geopolitical assertive regime. As the world struggled to contain the COVID-19 outbreak in late April 2020, Australia took the audacious step of spearheading calls for an impartial investigation into the virus's origins. Little did they know, this act of defiance would unleash a masterful display of economic puppetry from their puppet master, China. China's ambassador to Australia, Chang Jingyi, responded with a not-so-subtle threat, warning that the Chinese public is frustrated, dismayed, and disappointed, and that Australian tourists may have second thoughts about visiting, while the parents of the students would also think whether this place, which they find is not so friendly, even hostile, is the best place to send their kids. He even had the gall to suggest that maybe the ordinary people will think why they should drink Australian wine or eat Australian beef. Ouch! China appeared to be using its economic clout as a club, prepared to strike any Australian who ventured to disagree with its policies. As expected, the hits came quickly afterward, with China imposing an 80% tax on Australian barley exports. It could be contended that China was merely safeguarding its own interests, given earlier allegations that Australia was providing farmers with subsidies and disposing of barley below market value. However, it was evident from the timing of these actions, which followed Australia's request for an investigation, that this was an outright act of revenge. China was even more irritated on May 19th when the World Health Assembly, backed by 137 nations, including Australia and China itself, passed a motion calling for a comprehensive, independent, and impartial investigation into the pandemic's origins. But as data shows, Australia simply cannot afford to have China turn the screws any further. It's almost as if China has transformed Australia into its own personal economic vassal state, dangling the promise of lucrative trade and investment opportunities while wielding the ever-present threat of withdrawing them. The art of slaving Australia, if you will. All while Australia watches helplessly, torn between standing up for its values and preserving its economic well-being. In 2022, the relationship seemed to have hit its lowest point in decades. However, a more pragmatic approach has now prevailed. Most of those trade barriers have been removed, and the rhetoric on both sides has been significantly toned down. The two governments have even resumed their annual leader-level meetings, signaling a return to a more constructive dialogue. This shift reflects a few key factors. Firstly, China seems to have recognized that its earlier wolf warrior diplomacy and economic coercion tactics were counterproductive, alienating not just the Australian government, but also the important voting bloc of Chinese Australians. An essential wake-up call came from the pushback to statements that seemed to be aimed at the Chinese people rather than merely the government. Furthermore, China has realized that a full-scale invasion of Taiwan is just not possible in the near future, which has put an end to the military posturing and talk of war between the two nations. For Australia, the pragmatic calculus has prevailed. Exporters who were hit hard by the Chinese trade restrictions were eager to see a return to normalcy in the economic relationship. Furthermore, the Albanese government has emphasized the domestic political rhetoric surrounding security frameworks like the AUKUS and the Quad, portraying them as job development projects rather than just military posturing, even though it still supports them. It's crucial to remember that the underlying geopolitical tensions haven't entirely subsided. For instance, China continues to view the AUKUS pact with great mistrust because it sees it as a compound of a larger plan to limit its influence in the area. Furthermore, there are no indications that the Australian government will be re-evaluating this defense agreement. Australia needs to take a long, hard look in the mirror and realize that this whole China relationship has become a bit, well, unhealthy. The government in Canberra has made some half-hearted attempts scheduling high-level visits to India and Vietnam. But Australia's exports to India are a mere fraction of what it sends China's way. Australia needs to shore up its domestic capabilities and resilience and invest in industries that don't have it so bad for China. And for goodness sake, keep those critical assets away from Chinese hands. It's not easy cutting ties with your economic sugar daddy, or in this case, master. However, Australia must find a middle ground in this situation. Maintain China as a friend, of course, but also defend its own interests and morals. Comment down below what are your thoughts on this. Also, don't forget to subscribe and like this video.